back to the Elder Law Out Loud podcast. I'm Carla Ray here with CEO of Family First Firm and founding attorney Jeff Hotzen. And today we are going to be talking about the different ways that you can qualify for Medicaid, even if you're over the income and asset limit. Now, we're at the beginning of the year, and so those limits just recently changed, went up slightly due to a cost of living adjustment, which happens every year. But in general, we talk to clients often in Florida who are looking to save money on their long-term care costs. They're realizing that assisted living facilities, nursing homes, even in-home care can be very expensive and looking for options to help offset the cost. But they oftentimes believe that they wouldn't qualify for Medicaid because of those asset and income limits. This is a really common misconception.
Yeah, most people who need our services self-select out thinking, "Oh, I couldn't possibly just, mom has too much money. We could never get Medicaid."
Right.
So, they don't even come to our door. They don't even ask the questions.
Yeah. And so we hope that this will serve as a resource for people to know that that's actually not the case here in Florida and many other states as well. But none are quite as good as the Sunshine State
That's
when
right.
it comes to helping qualify. So we're going to let you in on some of the secrets today and some of the strategies that are available. So let's talk first about income qualification. So for 2026, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going off memory
Yeah,
here, $2,982
that's
per month.
that's right.
That is the income limit. So what if you make $2,985 a month?
Well, technically, you're no longer eligible. Now, unfortunately, that's if we take a step back and actually look at what we're trying to pay for. The easiest example is nursing home. Nursing homes are $13,000. So how does $3,000 a month? How are you supposed to pay for a nursing home with $3,000 a month when it costs $12,000 a month?
Right.
That doesn't make sense. So being over the income limit is not, I guess, a death sentence to your Medicaid eligibility because the math just doesn't math. So, Medicaid sets this limit and then they turn around and give us a waiver of the limit. And that's something called a qualified income trust, sometimes referred to as a Miller trust. Basically, what you have to do is put a minimum of the income that puts the applicant over that income limit. So, as an example, you said 29.85. So we'd have to put a minimum of $3 into
$3.
that qualified income trust each month. And then Medicaid says, okay, well, now you're eligible. Now we're not going to count the money that puts you over the limit because you've moved it into this trust, which seems like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But these are their rules, and this is what we have to go by.
Yeah. When I explain that to potential clients, they oftentimes either don't believe me or they think that there's a catch to it.
Yeah.
What is the catch?
Well, the catch is any money that goes into that trust can only be used for medical expenses. And if there's anything left in there after they pass away, it goes back to the state of Florida. Excuse me. So, you know, that's really the catch. Now, the silly thing about it is when you're in a nursing home on Medicaid, all of your income is going to go to the facility anyways. Medicaid gets the difference, you don't out of pocket. But Medicaid says, hey, if you have $3,000 a month in income, this facility costs $13,000 a month. Pay your income minus $160. They let you keep 160 for what they call the personal needs allowance. It's not a lot.
Cha-ching.
That's it. Yeah, getting rich, obviously. But if you're getting a $12 or $13,000 a month,
Right.
Benefit for, I won't say free, but for extremely reduced rate, they say, hey, we're going to cover most of your needs and expenses. So the 160 toiletries, maybe a haircut, new shirt or something.
Nice new aloe set.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Stay fit in the nursing home,
That's right. Right. And but the money that goes into that the qualified income trust is still going to flow out to the nursing facility.
It's just a pass-through
That's
account,
right.
which is so silly. Why is it still required?
Well, I because there's an income limit.
Okay.
Truly, there's not a good answer for why this exists. In my opinion, I think if why set a limit if your next move is to go and give people away at that limit?
Right.
Now, in Florida, you're required to do this with an attorney. So I'm not complaining about it.
Right.
Yeah,
Sure.
it does keep us busy, but ultimately, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like I'd probably say a lot of the laws in this country don't. But
And especially for people who that's the only thing that's disqualifying them if they're just slightly over the limit.
yeah,
It's very frustrating, I think,
absolutely.
for those people to understand. So qualified income trust is great if you're in a facility because you're going to be paying your income to the facility anyway. But for people who are living at home and maybe wanting a Medicaid benefit for in-home care or even assisted living facilities, um, there are some other options, right? Different types of pooled trusts.
Yeah. So it's actually the same qualified income trust, but being managed by an organization called a pool trust company. And those are not for profit companies that exist to run something called a pool trust, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the asset portion of the limit. But essentially, they exist just to get people eligible for benefits. That's the whole point of this not-for-profit is operating this pool trust, the purpose of which is to get people eligible for whether it's Medicaid or Social Security or whatever. So uh, they can serve as a trustee of this qualified income trust. And the reason, to your point, that people would use that when they're in home rather than in the facility is you don't have to pay your income to the facility when you're at home because there's no facility. The problem being is because if you use a qualified income trust that say maybe your spouse or your child is managing, they can only use that for your medical expenses. And if sometimes we have people that have maybe $4,000 or $5,000 a month of income, they're contributing $2,000 a month to this qualified income trust. They can't spend it quickly.
Mhm.
So it's just building and building and building. And as a reminder, the state of Florida gets whatever's left in there when that Medicaid recipient passes away.
Not only that, there's an asset limit to
Right.
Medicaid.
Well, there's an asset limit. Fortunately, any assets in the qualified income trust don't count
Oh,
against the
okay. Well,
asset
that's
limit. So
good.
that's good news. It doesn't disqualify, so that's positive. But a lot of people at home say, "Hey, I need to pay my mortgage. I need to pay my taxes and insurance and utilities. And if this money is just going into this trust and it will only be used for medical expenses, I can't pay my bills."
Very restrictive.
Yeah. So if you have this third party, pooled trust company doing it, they can use those funds for anything for you. So all the things we just talked about, taxes, mortgage, utilities, insurance, even credit card bills, they can pay those expenses with the money that's accruing in there. So you can bleed it back out each month to make sure that there's really nothing left by the time that Medicare passes away. That's always the goal. Now, um, they do charge for those services.
Okay.
Um, you know,
So that's the downside.
that's the downside. It could be anywhere from $60 to $120 a month, depending on who you're using. Um, but in the example, let's say you have $1,500 a month going into this account that you're kind of losing access to. Well, even if it's $120 a month, that's fairly cheap to
Right.
get access to the other 1,300 plus. So it still makes sense in a lot of cases.
Definitely for those who are living at home and need the money to pay for other things. Um, any other ways of qualifying someone who's over the income limit?
So those are the big ones. Sometimes there are ways of turning income, or maybe I'll say diverting income. One thing that we'll see is if you have a Medicaid applicant that has a retirement account. Um, we have been successful in moving those retirement accounts into like annuities, things of that nature that will pay out to a spouse.
Hmm.
We can't do it to children; it will only be to a spouse. But then the income now is considered the spouse's income because in Florida we use something called the name on the check rule. Another example might be if a Medicaid applicant has a piece of rental property, and instead we shift that rental property to the spouse's name. Now those rental payments get paid to the spouse, and like the spouse's name is on the check. Now Medicaid won't count that income against the Medicaid applicant.
Okay.
So sometimes we can shift income out of an applicant's name. They tend to be very specific sorts of situations, and they almost always revolve around giving it to a spouse, um, just based on the way our laws are set up, because it's kind of difficult otherwise. So yeah, and important to know, because I think some listeners may say, well, how does that help? They only look at the applicant's income. They don't look at the spouse's income. So you could have a Medicaid applicant who had, call it $500 a month of Social Security, and their spouse could have $10,000 a month for pension, Social Security, and RMDs and rental income or whatever. And that $10,000 a month is not considered by Medicaid, completely protected. That spouse can keep all of their own income while the person in the facility is paying their $500, or I guess technically $340 after they keep that
Right.
60 to the facility as part of their cost of care.
Okay. So what you just talked about kind of delves right into asset protection strategies. So someone can have an investment property in addition to their homestead, but it needs to be generating income.
That's true.
So talk about that.
It's even more nuanced than that
Okay.
because, yeah, so all of our strategies, I've talked about this before on this podcast, they fall into one of two buckets. Um, as kind of a backup high level, there's two rules about assets. You can't have more than $2,000 of countable assets, and you can't have gifted or transferred for less than fair market value any assets within 5 years of applying for Medicaid. Those are the two rules. So if you have more than 2,000, you can't just give it all away to your child and say, "Oh, help me, I'm broke." They don't let you do that. So, all of our strategies fall into one of two buckets. It's either taking countable assets and making them non-countable so that it doesn't count against that $2,000 asset limit, or we're taking those countable assets and we're transferring them in ways that are not gifts, in ways that Medicaid does permit to move them outside of somebody's name. As an example, we just mentioned that pooled trust would be an example of a permissible transfer. Also, transferring a piece of rental real estate to a spouse also operates as a permissible transfer. There's no limits on transferring assets between spouses. You could have someone who has $1 million in an investment account in their name, and they could give all of that to their spouse, and it doesn't violate the 5-year look back period, as an example. But getting back to what you're talking about with the rental properties, so you're allowed to have the primary homestead, no problem there. You can have other real estate provided either it's producing income. So, it's rented out and it's producing income. Now, you don't have to count all of the income towards as countable income because they let you deduct anything the IRS lets you deduct: interest, uh, utilities, repairs, property management, anything that the IRS will let you deduct, the state of Florida will let you deduct as well.
Okay.
So you have to kind of go through a calculation to figure out what actually counts. But they will ignore the value of the rental property. That principal value could be a $500,000 piece of property. They're going to say, "Hey, we don't care. That doesn't count anymore because we're only going to treat the income. That's the income limit. We're not counting the principal." You could also have a piece of property. Like, we have a client who had they own some commercial undeveloped, basically dirt. There's nothing on it. It's in an area that's somewhat valuable, and they've been trying to sell. And if you have a piece of property that is listed for sale, the state says, "We're not going to count it against you. Only when the property sells, you get money, then we'll count that against you." So you can even have property not counted that isn't producing income as long as it's listed for sale and you're making good faith efforts.
What is a good faith effort to sell?
That is a great question with a lot of gray area.
Okay.
Yeah. So generally, they're going to want to see it on some sort of professional listing, service, whether it's MLS or something else. There's kind of, I think, some other competing sorts of things out there that you could use to show that it's listed. Um, Generally, it's going to need to be listed as something that's somewhat close to fair market value. So you can't have a $50,000 piece of property that you're listing for $10 million.
Hmm.
That's not really good
That
faith.
it'll never sell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'll never. We generally don't have DCF come back and fight us on this stuff. That's also because we're normally counseling our clients. You want to do this the right way, because if you try to get greedy with it, then there's a chance Medicaid doesn't get approved, and now you're paying $13,000 a month. The juice isn't worth the squeeze
Sure.
in this.
So if a property is up for sale and you're qualifying for Medicaid through the property being listed as for sale, at the time of the applicant's passing, does Medicaid have a right to that property?
So Medicaid, their only recovery right in the state of Florida. So there are states that have what are called expanded recovery, and then there's standard recovery. Florida is a standard recovery state, which means their only option is to go after the probate of the Medicaid recipient after that Medicaid recipient passes away. That is their only way of ever being paid back. I actually had a gentleman reach out to me. It was a super crazy story. He and his wife were from a Middle Eastern country. They happened to be visiting in the States. She was pregnant. She ended up going into labor early, delivered here. They did the insurance that worked everywhere in the world except the United States and Canada. So they didn't have insurance. Whoever it was at the hospital applied for Medicaid for them, and it was approved. Now they paid far too much money. It never should have been approved, but it was approved. They covered the hospital stay and the subsequent, the delivery and the subsequent hospital stay. 20 years later, his daughter, well, not 20, I guess it was probably like 17, 18. His daughter is coming over here. She got admitted into Stanford. She's going to school in Stanford. He wants to come visit her. He can't get a visa because of this Medicaid issue, because they had Medicaid and there's an outstanding balance. He got me involved to try to figure out, how do we pay this balance? The state of Florida is like, we won't take the money because our only right of recovery is a
Is
probate
when
estate
right.
when somebody passed away.
And it would be the daughter, right? It would be her estate since she was the recipient?
Well, I think technically the recipient might have been his wife, but it
Okay.
was maybe they applied like as a family or something. I'm not entirely certain. But ultimately, he could not get a visa because he could not pay this debt because the state of Florida wouldn't accept the money because they say we have no way of actually accepting that. That's nothing that is permissible under our rules. There was nothing I could do, which is crazy. But the point of all this going back, how do they recover? They can only recover against the probate estate. And that's what I use that as an example to show just how serious that is.
Yeah.
So in your question of, hey, what if there's this property that's listed? Well, if the property has like a ladybird deed on it, it transfers outside of probate or has a co-owner
Mhm.
who, it would be like tenants with right of survivorship, not
Mhm.
tenants in common,
Or it's in a
or
trust.
it's in a trust. Well, trusts generally are supposed to file notice of trust and allow creditors to place claims against them, but
Oh, okay.
that's kind of a separate thing. Um, but ultimately, though, if there was some way of that property transferring by what they call operation of law, so like a ladybird deed is like that, co-ownership, that sort of thing. It doesn't go through probate. Medicaid doesn't have a right of recovery, so they can't come back after it. If it's just in the applicant's name or it's a common or something, then that property would have to go through probate, and the state of Florida would absolutely have the right to come back and place a claim against it, force the property to be sold so that their claim could be satisfied.
So you definitely want to work with an attorney
Yeah,
if you're going through this process to make sure that you have a way to legally transfer the property so that it's not subject to that sort of clawback.
there are so many considerations when we do Medicaid planning. People think, oh, it's just about getting Medicaid. Well, it is important to get Medicaid, but there's tax implications, there's Medicaid payback provisions, you have probate avoidance, there's all these other pieces to that puzzle. Shifting income, as we've talked about, making sure that maybe a spouse or an adult child are protected or their interests or rights, are considered. So it's not just about getting Medicaid. It's kind of this whole picture. Unfortunately, that's where we see a lot of these non-attorney planners focus just on Medicaid to the exclusion of all these other issues that can really put clients in a bad space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we talked about property because I think when people think of assets, they think of homes
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
But accounts with any sort of balance above that $2,000 limit. There are a number of different ways that are Medicaid compliant to
Right.
move that sort of money. What do you think is the most common way that we do here?
The most common way here is probably, hmm, so for married couples, moving to the spouse.
Sure.
If not married, adult children who are around and involved, we probably use personal service contracts the most frequently.
Okay.
Sometimes called personal care contracts. Essentially, what it is it's a way of paying love to provide care and support. So back in the 90s, we did away with basically mandated responsibility to take care of loved ones. So in the state of Florida, other states still have this, and they say, hey, if you are a child, then you have an obligation to take care of your parent.
Hmm.
And your parent doesn't need to do that because you have this obligation. Well, we did away with that here. And so as a child, now you have no more obligation to take care of a parent than just a random stranger walking down the street has to take care of your parent. Because of that, the state of Florida will let your parent pay you to provide care and support. Now, because it's a payment, it is not a gift, so it doesn't violate the 5-year look back period. But because it's a payment, the recipient's supposed to claim it as taxable income. Under the IRS definitions, that is now earned income. You have to claim it as ordinary income. It's not long-term capital gains or anything like that. You have to claim it as tax.
Okay. So, how does that look when a person maybe receives $100,000, $200,000 through one of these personal service contracts all at once? Their tax bill is going to be crazy for 1 year.
It would be.
And then does it reset?
Yeah. So remember, with income, it's only what we earn in that year. So, if I'll just make up an example, if somebody um, let's use a social media influencer as an example, and they have some stuff that goes viral in 1 year, it makes a ton of money in that year, and then the next year nothing goes viral and they don't make as much money. Well, they don't get taxed on the previous year and the
Mhm.
subsequent. Or even if I use the example of like the law firm here, if we have a really good year and we have a lot of income that we pay taxes on it that year, we don't pay tax on it the next year. And so it's the same of this sort of stuff as well. You would have something earning a bunch of money in 1 year, and it's all about the year that you receive it. So sometimes we'll see if somebody is applying for Medicaid, let's say December, a family member may take half of it in December and then half of it in January, and split it up over 2 years, so that then they can like lower, so they don't
Sure.
go too far up, additional brackets on the ladder. Um, but yeah, but it's taxed in the year that you receive, and then from that point on, you pay the taxes on it, and it's all protected. Everything else is never have to pay tax on it again.
Okay. So that's the most common way. Let's talk about my favorite way,
Okay.
which is when the stars align and the applicant doesn't have a homestead of their own
Mhm.
and they can invest in their child's homestead.
Yeah, that's
It's my favorite strategy.
it's a cool thing. There's no tax associated with it, which is awesome. Basically, so the strategy is that you're allowed to have a homestead property. Everybody who applies for Medicaid is allowed to have a homestead property. And if an applicant doesn't have homestead, but maybe they have the proceeds of a sale for homestead, they can reinvest that into a new homestead for themselves. That homestead could be the child's home. And so they could pay the child in order to have that child add them to the deed. Now we always have to get an appraisal or figure out a fair market value for that property, and then pay. I'm sorry, not pay, but assign the parent the appropriate percentage. So I'm just going to make up numbers here. If the parent has $200,000 to pay in, the child's house is worth $400,000. The parent gets a half interest in the property because 200,000 is half 400,000. So then that parent owns half of their house. We update the deed so that when that parent passes away, the house automatically goes their share automatically goes back to their kids. And now it's been $200,000 to move to a child, non-taxable event.
And it's not a gift.
It's not a gift because that parent purchased an interest in the property. And then they decided part of their estate planning goals, they wanted to put a ladybird deed as an example for their one half interest so that when they pass away, property goes right back to them. So it ends up being kind of status quo at the end. Now we've got all this money in the parents' name. We've gotten them eligible for Medicaid. The child is still able to retain those funds and use it to supplement their parents' care,
Right.
which is what we see most common with these funds is, it's not like, oh, the child's got the money and haha, I protected my inheritance. But it's, hey, making sure that mom or dad has the best quality of life and the best quality of care for as long as possible. And often Medicaid pays for a lot, but it doesn't pay for everything.
Sure.
And so, you may want to bring in better food than what is being provided in the facility. You may want to have, I guess, not fun to think about, but maybe better diapers. Maybe like some nice quality Depends or something like that, rather than the stuff that might be, I hate to say it, but maybe a little more conducive to a pressure sore, a bed sore, some of those types of things. Um, it may even be paying the difference between a semi-private room, which is a room with two people and and a sheet out of the middle,
Hmm.
and the difference to put somebody in a private room.
Sure.
So, you have the option, you have those dollars. If you pay until they run out of money and now they're on Medicaid, you don't have those options. Unless as an adult child, you want to use your own money to pay all those differences. So, my perspective is always, if you can use mom or dad's protective for them, use it to supplement what Medicaid pays for. They just have a better quality of care, better quality of life
Yeah.
for a lot longer.
And whenever I explain that strategy to clients, they're like, okay, so what do I do with the money when I receive it? It's really up to you.
Yeah.
It becomes your asset instead of mom and dad's. All right. So we've covered personal service contracts. We've covered a pocket deed, which is what that's called. And then what other types of strategies can we use?
So going back to the beginning, there is that pool trust as an option. You could take Bill Gates, get eligible for Medicaid by using the pool trust. He could take everything of value he has, dump it into a pool trust, and be eligible for Medicaid immediately. It wouldn't make any sense. It'd be stupid, right? But it would work. So it's a strategy that works for everybody. Now the pooled trust charge a percentage of what's in there. So they're charging like, on average between 2 and maybe 3% per year. So if you put Bill Gates billions in there, well, they're making out like a bandit.
Sure. Pool trust companies are like, bring it on,
Yeah.
Billy.
Exactly. That's why I say, like, it wouldn't make sense. But that's a strategy. One strategy that I love for married couples is something called spousal refusal. The company name is a pretty beautiful strategy where essentially we move all of the financial assets to the well spouse, even though there's a limit, and the limit right now is 162,660. That just went up this year. For a community spouse, that's a wealth, to have incountable assets beyond the $2,000 that the Medicaid applicant has. So call it basically about 164,000 and change. We'll say 165. It's an easy rounding. If you had more, and we use a spousal refusal strategy, you sign paperwork saying, "Hey, I'm not going to use this money to pay for my spouse," and the state of Florida says, "Well, okay, then we'll cover that."
Just crazy.
It is, but it's a great strategy and it
Yeah.
works, and
People have feelings about it, though.
they do.
Yeah.
It sounds terrible. And people say, like, "Why would I? We've been married for 50 years.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm going to do whatever to take care of my spouse." And I know that. I know that you will, and that you would. But and this doesn't mean that you can't visit your spouse or spend time or even provide financial support to your spouse. It just means that for the purpose of this Medicaid application, you're not making those assets available for the cost of the enlargement facility. So the state of Florida says, okay, then we will. And the reason this exists is because there's so many, because we are an aging state here. We have a lot of seniors and older population. There's a lot of second marriages. People bring in their own assets into these second marriages. And because one person all of a sudden needs a lot of care, it doesn't make sense. This other person who, you know, all of their assets were from this.
Yeah.
This, in most cases, this husband that now is having an issue. And as men, we tend to burn out a little bit quicker or have issues quicker because we ignore them, whatever it is. So ultimately, now this husband is having a lot of care needs and he runs out of his money. And then the state of Florida says, well, he can't get Medicaid because he has this spouse that now brought in all this money from a previous relationship that, was earned prior to this relationship. And so it kind of makes sense. Why should that person or that family, with her kids be subject to divestment of their inheritance or her be able to, the money that she spent her life accruing because she happened to get married?
Right.
It doesn't make a ton of sense. And so, that's why the spousal refusal option exists.
Okay. So, in some cases, there are no children with homesteads who can accept that sort of pocket deed. They're not interested in doing the personal services contract either because it doesn't make sense because they can't get here to actually perform those services, or they don't want to pay the taxes on it. There's another option called Epic,
Sure.
which is the most confusing option to me. So try to explain it to me like I'm 5.
Cool. Okay. Like, it is confusing. So remember we were talking previously about the rental income exception. Most people don't. They say, that sounds terrible. I don't want to own this rental property. I'm responsible to get tenants in there, keep them on the straight and narrow, make sure they don't destroy the place, the repairs and everything. Or if they don't leave, then I got to do evictions. It sounds like a train wreck.
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with it, and I don't blame them. A elder law attorney, a real estate attorney recognized that there was this option out there, but there was this major problem that people didn't want to be landlords. And they said, well, what if we create a company and we buy up a bunch of rental real estate and we sell interest in these properties, but we deal with them. So we'll sell somebody maybe a 1/2 interest in the rental property. We'll guarantee them a certain amount of monthly income. And I'll make up an example here. They give us $100,000 and we're going to guarantee them a $250 or $300 monthly rental income from this property. Now, that exists whether the property is rented or not. It could be sitting empty, but they're still getting the income. The applicant never gets to pay for taxes or insurance or repairs or maintenance or upkeep or anything. They're just guaranteed that monthly income and they never have to worry about it. That is what Epic is, essentially. So the way it works is the Medicaid applicant actually owns a portion of that property. They're not buying into like a REIT. I think a lot of a real estate investment trust. A lot of people assume it's something similar to that. It's not. You have direct ownership of a piece of that property. It might even be the whole property, depending on
How much you
how
put
much
in.
money you're putting in. But ultimately, that property then is ignored. The value of that is ignored because it's producing income that's fair market and
What's the word?
commensurate, commensurate with the amount of money that was initially invested.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. It was up there somewhere. Um,
I'll take your word for it.
yeah. So the bottom line is, if you put in like $1 million, you could get $100 a month.
Mhm.
It would need to be like fair market value for what you invested. And by doing that, then what happens is, this is the piece that gets a little tricky, is if the investment has stayed or the money has been invested for at least 5 years after the Medicaid applicant passes away, the company Epic will buy back that property for the full amount of what was invested originally. You don't get any appreciation if frankly invested there play. Probably they're getting the appreciation on it, but you're guaranteeing back 100% of what was put.
So it's a way to park your money,
Essentially,
essentially.
yeah, and turn it into some income. People say, well, what happens if it's less than 5 years? Well, they charge you a penalty per year if you want to take it up. Let's say mom passes in year 3. I think it's about 8% per year, which is pretty steep, which is why I tell people don't take the money out until it's about 5 years. But what happens if someone passes away in year three and now the kids own this property? Well, what now? Well, they still get the income. That income is still going to go to the kids and they're going to get it. And if they want to wait for that 5 year mark, well, then they can get the income until 5 years. Then they, I call it, redeem the property back. So then Epic buys it back from 100% of what went in. It doesn't have to go through probate or anything. They
Mhm.
get a check in the mail, but essentially they did get the income along the way.
Okay. Real quick, because we're running out of time, talk about income streaming certain retirement accounts.
Yeah,
Because you could have $1 million sitting in a retirement account. You would think that that's an asset.
right. And it is, but it also could not. And so remember I talked about turning countable assets non-countable. This is that. So while a retirement account may normally be counted, if you take equal monthly distributions from that account. So as an example, let's say it's you have required minimum due distributions of, I'm going to make it easy for myself, $6,000 a year. Instead of taking $6,000 at once, which is how most people do this, if you take $500 a month, Medicaid treats that $500 as income and they ignore the balance of the IRA. So in your example, you could have a $1 billion IRA. Now Medicaid ignores and they say that's non-countable because you have monthly income coming out of it in the equal monthly installments. People say, well, what if you're not taking required minimum distributions? Well, then you actually are, you don't have to take a certain amount. You could, in theory, take $50 a month out, and that's sufficient to meet their requirement that equal monthly installments are coming out of it. And then there's the fair market, like there was with the rental property, put in $1 million and get $100 a month. There's none of that here. So you could have a one, two, $10 million retirement account taking out $50 a month, as long as you're not at the RFD age, and Medicaid wouldn't work.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah. So, bottom line, if you are in Florida and you're facing the cost of long term care and you think that you don't qualify for Medicaid, there probably is a way to qualify.
That's right.
Yeah.
And these are just some of the many, like I could sit and talk about this all day. There are so many different strategies. Florida is the best state you need to be Medicaid because we have so many ways to protect what people have.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just some of that,
Yeah.
which is cool.
Well, and each plan is individualized. It's never one size fits all. So if you are facing those care costs, obviously give us a call here at Family First Firm. We would love to talk you through all those different options. And I think this episode is going to be a great resource for people. So thank you, Jeff. All right. And thank you for watching and listening. We will see you next time.